It was a chilly autumn evening, and the grand mansion of the wealthy Mr. Edward Blackwood was alive with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. The dining room was adorned with sparkling chandeliers, and the long mahogany table was set with fine china and silverware. Mr. Blackwood, a retired businessman known for his sharp wit and even sharper temper, had invited a small group of friends and family for a dinner party. Among the guests were his niece, Clara, his business partner, Mr. Henry Grayson, his lawyer, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, and his old friend, Dr. Samuel Reed. Detective Arthur Lane, a tall man with a keen eye for detail, had also been invited. He wasn't a close friend of Blackwood's, but the two had crossed paths during a previous investigation. Lane had a feeling this dinner wasn't just about good food and conversation. Something felt off. The evening began smoothly. The guests exchanged pleasantries, and the first course was served a creamy soup that everyone seemed to enjoy. But as the main course arrived, a roasted duck with all the trimmings, the atmosphere began to shift. Mr. Blackwood, who had been in high spirits, suddenly grew quiet. His face turned pale, and he clutched his throat. I can't breathe," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The room erupted into chaos. Clara screamed, Dr. Reed rushed to Blackwood's side, and Mrs. Harper froze in her seat. Detective Lane immediately took charge, instructing someone to call for an ambulance. But it was too late. Within minutes, Mr. Blackwood was dead. The police arrived quickly, but Detective Lane knew this was no ordinary death. The symptoms pointed to poisoning, and the killer was likely one of the guests at the table. Lane decided to investigate the scene himself. He examined Blackwood's plate and glass, noticing a faint, bitter smell coming from the wine. "Who poured the wine?" Lane asked, turning to the guests. "I did," said Henry Grayson, his hands trembling. "But I swear, I didn't poison him. Edward was my friend." Lane raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." He then turned to Clara, who was sobbing quietly. "Did your uncle have any enemies?" Clara shook her head. "Not that I know of. But he did argue with Henry recently about some business deal." Mrs. Harper, the lawyer, chimed in. "Edward was planning to change his will. He mentioned it to me just yesterday. He wanted to cut someone out." Lane's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Before Mrs. Harper could answer, Dr. Reed interrupted. "This is ridiculous. Edward was a good man. Someone must have slipped the poison into his drink when no one was looking." Lane wasn't convinced. He began questioning each guest, piecing together their movements during the evening. Clara had been in the kitchen helping the cook, Henry had been pouring drinks, Mrs. Harper had been on the phone in the study, and Dr. Reed had stepped outside for a smoke. As Lane dug deeper, he discovered that Blackwood had indeed been planning to change his will. He had found out that Henry had been embezzling money from their business and wanted to cut him out entirely. Mrs. Harper had the new will in her briefcase, ready to be signed after dinner. But the most damning evidence came when Lane examined the wine bottle. The poison had been added to the bottle, not just Blackwood's glass. This meant the killer had access to the wine before it was brought to the table. Lane turned to Dr. Reed. "You were outside, you said. But I saw you near the wine cabinet earlier. Care to explain?" Dr. Reed's face turned red. I was just checking the labels. I didn't touch anything." Lane didn't believe him. He pressed further, and eventually, Dr. Reed broke down. "Fine, I did it. Edward was going to expose me. I've been prescribing him fake medication for years, and he found out. He threatened to ruin me." The room fell silent as Dr. Reed confessed to poisoning the wine. He had hoped to silence Blackwood before he could reveal the truth, but his plan had backfired, and now he would face the consequences. As the police led Dr. Reed away, Detective Lane sighed. Another case solved, but the taste of victory was bittersweet. The dinner party had ended in tragedy, and the guests would never forget the night death came to dinner.